All right, so we will hop right in. What is sexual health and sexuality? So I just encourage people to sort of like give some thought and sort of think about when I say sexual health or sexuality, what things come to mind? What things do you think of? What things do you think are important? What things do you think should be excluded? And so for me, sexual health and sexuality is really, the first thing is that I want to make it clear that these are not synonymous with physical acts of sex. When I tell people that I'm a sex educator, they sort of think that that means like teaching the mechanics of sex, which is something that I very rarely, if ever, have done. And really, we're talking about all of these other things. So knowledge, attitudes, values, behaviors. Biology is certainly in there. I think if lots of people reflect on their own sexual health education experiences, it tended to be very biology focused, or we remember the like diagrams of the body parts. But we're also seeing that we need to include in this conversation issues of identity, orientation, gender roles, social expectations. And we also have to recognize how these things are shaped by our culture, history, education, experience, religion. And that's important for both like if we're a service provider who is providing services to clients, it's the history, education, experience of ourselves as a service provider. It's the history of the client, it's the history of the family, it's the history of the client's communities, be those school, a religious community. All of that is going to come together to sort of define sexual health and sexuality. And one thing I don't have on here, which is cueing me in to remember to add, is safety. I think sexual health and sexuality is really about safety. And we'll touch on that a few times throughout the day so you can sort of see where that is coming up. And while I really think that sexual health education is safety education and is social justice education as well. And I really like this diagram of sexuality. This is from teachingsexualhealth.ca, the website in the bottom corner there. No QR code for this one, but people can go there. That's a resource from partially funded by the Alberta government. It's a really great website that has resources for parents, for teachers, broken down by age group. There's a small section there on teaching disabilities as well. So I encourage people to explore resources like that. And I like the idea that this is sort of like a spoke kind of model where like all of these things are contributing to sexuality, right? So, and we could probably add lots of things on here, or people could like branch off from all of these as well. So communication, for instance, that can be a challenge for lots of autistic children, youth, and adults. And so we might branch off from there for like verbal, nonverbal communication, augmentative and alternative communication, right? How are we teaching sexuality through some of those things? How do we teach people with communication challenges about some of those things? So I won't go through the whole wheel, but you can sort of see by looking at it and again by visiting the website that all of these things are going to contribute in a variety of different ways. And it could probably be expressed as like a 3D model where for some people those things are closer to the sexuality in the middle, and for some people those things are further away. And it's really sort of like a malleable thing that changes throughout people's lives, but is important to recognize how complex sexuality and sexual health really is. And so what about autistic people? And how do we see these like intersections of sexuality and sexual health for people that are autistic? I focused on autistic people here because autism community training, but a lot of these things are true for people with a variety of disabilities, whether that's somebody that's physically disabled, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. These things that we'll talk about in the next few slides are really true for all of those groups, but I've labeled it as autistic people for the purposes of today. And so what I've seen, and I've heard some other folks in the field starting to talk about this sort of dichotomy as well, is that we see sort of two ends of a spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum, when people think about sexuality and autism, we think about asexuality, or really it's more of like desexualized. Asexuality is an identity that some people may have where they don't have sexual attraction or an interest in acts of sex, and that could be possible for somebody that is autistic as well. But people with autism and other disabilities are really desexualized, and so it's assumed that those people have no sexuality. We have no interest in sexuality, and that they should really be kept protected and childlike, and that autistic people don't need this information, right? Because, well, they're not going to use it, so we don't need to give it to them. And we can see how this has sort of played out for lots of folks, and I'll talk about some of the ways that I see that happening in the next slide. And then the other end of the spectrum, we see this hypersexual stereotype, where we think that people have uncontrollable sexual expression. Other people need to be protected. People need to be protected from themselves, right? They're going to cause harm, or they're going to get themselves into trouble, or they're having some sort of deviant sexual behavior. Or if we provide information that the person's not going to be able to handle it, they're not going to understand, they're not going to know what to do with it, or if we talk about it, then they're going to want to go and do it. And we know that this is not true based on research from just the field of sex education in general. So we know places that have abstinence-only sex education where people aren't given accurate information that's inclusive and accessible, that in those places the actual rates of unintended teen pregnancy are higher. The age at which somebody has their sexual debut or their first sexual experience is lower, and rates of sexually transmitted infections are higher than in places with comprehensive sexual health education, such as British Columbia, where I'm lucky enough to live and work, where we have comprehensive sexual health education. The rates of sexually transmitted infections are lower, and the rate of unintended teen pregnancy is lower, and the age at which people have their sexual debut is higher. And so we don't have any reason to believe that autistic people are going to be any different with that information. Information is power, and knowledge is safety. And so if people have this information, they're going to be able to make informed, safe decisions. We need to help to support people to be able to get information that's accessible to them so that they can be safe. And we've sort of forgotten about this whole sort of purplish yellow sphere in the middle, right? And this is where most people are going to fall, just like any other sort of curve of any sort of human behavior. Most people are going to fall somewhere in the middle. We're going to have people that are asexual, and we may have some people that have out of control sexual behaviors, but we can find ways to help people with addressing them. But those are going to be the minorities. Most people are going to fall in the middle. And so the ways that I've seen this, both in my practice and in discussions with folks who are autistic or have worked supporting autistic people, is exclusion from planned sex education. And this might be purposeful exclusion, so an actual conversation of this person doesn't need that information, so they can go to do this other class when the sex education lesson is being delivered. Or what I see more often is an accidental or an unintentional exclusion, but sex education isn't presented in a way that's accessible to all of the learners, say, in a classroom. We also can see an exclusive focus on abduction and abuse prevention. This is obviously very important. We want to teach people about abduction and abuse prevention, absolutely, very important. But particularly for referrals or requests I get around teaching abduction prevention by strangers, those aren't the people that are harming children. Only 7% of cases of child sexual abuse are committed by a stranger. The other 93% are committed by somebody who's known to the child. So we really need to think about how can we create a safety culture within individual families, communities that can help to prevent abuse. Or we look at it, other things like teaching only self-care skills. So we're okay, sex education, that means puberty, that means teaching the person how to shave, how to do menstrual care. Obviously those things are important, but we can't just teach just that. Or we might see that something is shame or fear-based, so a lot of don't do this, don't do that, a lot of those sorts of messages, or being scared of unintended pregnancy or sexually transmitted infections. Reactivity is a big one that I see, and so I'm hoping that today people will sort of see the importance of proactive, preventative sex education, because it's much, much, much harder to help support somebody once something has happened, right? There's an inappropriate sexual behavior that's occurred, and that's going to be challenging to address if the person has had no sexual health education. They don't know the names of their body parts, they don't know public and private, some of those sorts of things. When sex ed occurs, it can often be significantly delayed, right? So we're seeing like the kind of classic like waiting until puberty or waiting until the physical signs of puberty happen to start any sort of sexual health education or conversation. And we really need to try to be a bit more proactive. And we also see a lot of assumed heterosexuality, which means like we're presenting materials or talking about maybe like acts of sex that focus on like a typical heterosexual bodies, or cis normativity, so focusing on materials and teaching that isn't inclusive of trans and gender diverse folks. And we'll talk about at the end today about why that is particularly important when it comes to supporting autistic communities. So these two statements are one from the United Nations and one from SIECUS, which is the Sexuality, Information, Education Council of the United States. And I won't read these, but essentially more and more international organizations are recognizing and making statements that are supportive of the right to sexual health education for people with disabilities in particular, but really for all folks. Sexual health education, like I said, is safety education. And people have a right to be able to make safe, informed choices about their bodies. And I think that that is true for disabled people as well.